Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 through 30. I might actually back up a little bit and read a couple of verses even before that. But I'm going to read that in two translations. I'm going to read, first of all, in the King James translation, Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 through 30. Give everybody a minute to get there. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 says, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden." Has anybody ever felt like that's life? Their life. Labor and heavy labor. "And I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now let me read that in the Message Bible. It's Matthew chapter 11 again. And I am going to read verse 28 through 30. And he says this. He says in verse 28, and this is the Message translation, "Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn," listen to this phrase, "learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." How powerful is that? Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 through 30. Now, we're going to talk this morning specifically about this soul transformation piece. But what I want to dive into is I want to dive into this understanding of walking in meekness. Because soul transformation and having a renewed mind has to do with you and I walking in meekness. People of godly character yield themselves to the meekness and gentleness of Christ. Okay, that's important to know. We just read in Matthew 11, people of godly character will yield themselves to the meekness and the gentleness of Christ. If you ask me this morning to define what meekness is, it's very similar to humility, except in this. Humility is normally towards God. Be humble towards God. Where meekness is towards men. This is the difference. The difference is humility is normally spoken in context of you and I being humble before God. Meekness is spoken in context of you and I being humble towards others. When I say others, that could mean your spouse, that could mean your children, that could mean on your workplace, that could mean your friends, that could mean anybody who is even in the marketplace, that could mean anybody in your context or in your sphere. This is being meek towards anybody in your context or your sphere. Now you'll see how this ties into soul transformation in just a moment. Because we see in Matthew 11 where he says to you and I that we are to take his yoke upon us and learn of him. A lot of people don't want a yoke exchange. They don't want to receive a yoke exchange like he says here in Matthew 11. But he says, "I want you to take my yoke upon you." What yoke is that? If you look at the Greek word for "my yoke is easy," that Greek word is translated kindness. So Jesus here says, "My yoke is kindness." And he says, "I want you to take my yoke upon you. My yoke of kindness is what I'm telling you to take on." So he says, if you'll take that, he says, Jesus says, "I am meek and lowly in heart." So Jesus himself is telling you he is meek and he is lowly in heart. And we're going to get into this in just a minute and see exactly how this applies to how we grow in our relationship with God and how we grow in renewing our mind. Humility needs to be exercised. Remember I said humility is before God. It's often spoken of in context of with God, and meekness is in context of with man. So humility needs to be exercised before God. Before. Real meekness can be exercised before men. Let me say that again. Humility has to be exercised with God. You and I need to be humble with God before we can truly walk in meekness towards men. We can't actually walk in the meekness we need to towards men until we have humbled ourselves before the Lord and we're walking in humbleness or humility before God. Meekness is something that is experienced. It is something that any real relationship has to have, and it truly is the key to success. I'll tell you this morning this one thing. I can tell you truly that keys to your relationships are not based in changing other people. Keys to your relationships are based in walking in meekness. Your key to your relationship is not because your spouse needs to change, or because your children need to change, or because your friends need to change, or because others need to change. Your key to walking in a successful relationship is that you and I walk in meekness. We walk in the meekness and humility of Christ. And we're going to dive into that even deeper, like I said, in just a minute. Okay? So, meekness is experienced. It is meekness that leads to success in every relationship. It has to be built that way. So I'm going to break this down into a couple of things this morning that we're going to talk about. And number one is this point. Number one. First point is this. Meekness or meek people are humble in spirit, lowly in mind, submitted and compliant to the word. That is number one. So that might disappear on here. It is. All right. So meek people are what? Number one. I think I'm going to have to erase this to get myself some order. Just a minute here. I'll just do this right here. I think that'll get most of it. I'm going to need the room for this. Let's get this. 4 points we're talking about being meek, walking in meekness this morning. So, the first point, and we see this in Matthew chapter 11, the first point here is that meekness or meek people are humble in spirit. They're humble in spirit. Remember I said earlier that you have to have humility towards God before you can really have meekness towards others. So you're humble in spirit, lowly in mind, okay? And you are compliant to the word. Okay. So this is one thing that we're looking at when we're talking about those who walk in meekness. Those who walk in meekness are what? They are humble in spirit. They are lowly in mind. And they are compliant to the Word of God. What's the opposite of being lowly in mind? It's called being high-minded. If you get ruffled and bothered when people tell you things like, hey, you just have to wait for a few minutes, and you come into a restaurant, you wait for they come and they tell you, okay, you got to wait for 45 minutes. Well, they just need more people in this restaurant. I wish they just had more servers. They could just really. That's a problem. You know why? Because that's not meekness. That is being high-minded. So I don't know if you've ever been, going into a Walmart, and you're there in the Walmart. I just did this the other day, and I caught myself. I'm there in the Walmart, and there's a bunch of registers, and there's 88 registers here. You got the largest retail store probably in the nation. There's 88 registers out here, and out of these 88 registers, you got 3 of them running. And all of a sudden, you go in, and it happens to be the very time you go in, it's the time when they're changing out the drawers. And so you're there waiting, and you're like, okay, you got 88 registers here, you only got 3 people working them, it's the busiest time of the day, and here you are, and I happen to come up here and happen to change the drawer. I'm like, well, if they had more people, I caught myself, you know what? Just be me. Just be humble. Just humble yourself, and you know what? Pick up a magazine. Maybe you read the National Enquirer and find out that the latest 8 ways to please your husband or please your wife or something. I don't know. Do something. You know what I mean? And just say, you know what? It's going to be okay. That's all you have to do is just say it's going to be all right. You know why? Because now what you're saying is this. What happens when you say things like, those are dumb rules. You ever said that? Well, those are dumb rules. They tried to tell me to do this, but that's a dumb rule. I don't want to obey that rule. I can remember I can remember situations like that where I'm walking down the road and there's a crosswalk, and here you're supposed to cross right here, but I don't want to do that. I'm not going to cross there, it's a little inconvenient. It's too far down the road to walk, and I'm going to cross earlier. Or I'm running down driving down the street and the speed's 55 miles an hour, but I'm going to run 80, and I justify it. All that kind of stuff, that is not being meek, because you're not being compliant to good, solid rules. Just rules that are good rules. That's a meekness issue. Meek people are humble in spirit. They're lowly in mind. In other words, they're not high-minded. If you call someone and they're not available and your blood pressure goes up, you got a meekness issue. Because you think that they should be waiting on you on the other end of the phone. Right? You go into the theater, and you're at the theater, and you put your feet up on the back of the seat of the theater or something like that, and somebody comes by and they say, you know what, get your feet up. I don't know who they think they are. And you start talking, you know what? That's a meekness issue. You go into the church and you think you have a seat, you always sit that same seat every service, and there's 150 other seats you could sit at, but you come in and you sit down, the usher says, no, you can't sit there. The usher says, you know what, could you sit over here, that's reserved. And I don't know who I paid for that seat. I don't know who they think they are. I've been in this church for years. You know what, and you got a bad attitude the rest of the service, and you got a bad attitude. Why? Because you have a meekness issue. Meekness is a root issue. People say, oh, they have an anger problem. Listen, anger is always a secondary response. Anger is always a secondary emotion. All right, now you got to. This is very important to understand. Anger is a secondary emotion. It's not a primary emotion. Somewhere under anger is another root issue. Either you're not meek, either you're offended, or you're hurt, or something else is going on, but anger is always a secondary issue. That's what we see on the surface, but underneath is something different. And when you say, well, it doesn't matter, I don't have to listen to that person, or whatever it is, what you're saying is your understanding is superior, and theirs is inferior. That's what you're saying. So when you have a rule that's given to you, like you're driving down the road, I don't need to obey that 55, I don't think that's the right speed limit, and you're running 75. What you're saying is, well, my understanding is superior, and theirs is inferior.